And we're live in 5,
4,
3,
2,
1.
All right, go ahead and get started.
How you doing, everyone? Good evening. My name is John Mangan. I'm here with Justin Stahl tonight, and Laura Lauth Andrews, who's been kind enough to join us tonight. She's from Lauth O'Neill, which is a law firm that specializes in physician and physician extender contracts. And she's got a wealth of knowledge in this area, which hopefully she is going to share with us all so we can learn how to get better contracts and jobs that we want. So without further ado, Laura, thank you for your help.
Thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. As he mentioned, my name is Laura Lauth Andrews. I'm excited to have been invited to participate in this conference. I think helping and educating younger physicians about the job search process and the contract process is so incredibly important. God knows you guys don't really receive this type of instruction at any other point in your training. So I'm happy to have this chance to share some of the advice and guidance that I've learned over the years. As John mentioned, I am an attorney. I'm based in Indianapolis, Indiana. So I am, of course, licensed here. I'm also licensed in Illinois, and I actually serve physician clients throughout the country. I work exclusively on behalf of physicians and some advanced practice providers as well, and working to get physicians jobs and negotiate their employment contracts is literally all that I do. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the insights to this process that my experience has given me. So I will go ahead and get started, and remember to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
That looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay. To begin with, my required disclaimer. Being a lawyer is so fun. We always have to cover our bases. So I have to share, while I welcome the opportunity to work with anyone, I am not your attorney, and what I'm about to share and discuss with you is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. What I'm going to discuss tonight is twofold. The first part will be a look into the job search process itself, what I call finding the premier opportunity. The second part is looking at the contract review, analysis, and negotiation aspect, what I call analyzing and shaping. So going back here real quick, the aspects of the job search process that I'm most concerned with are knowing your value, identifying what is most important to you and your family. And from a very pragmatic perspective, I of course encourage doing a comprehensive search and leaving no stone unturned. So what does it mean to know your value? What sort of unique training and qualifications do you have that set you apart from other job candidates? And what are some of the personality traits that make you the ideal choice? Maybe you're a natural leader, maybe you're very business-minded and oriented, and would be the type of person people would want to have as a partner in their practice, for instance. Identifying these traits can be tough for a lot of us, as we generally aren't used to rattling off what makes us great, so it can be super helpful to get the input of family and friends. It's imperative to know what is unique and great about you so that you can effectively communicate that to your potential employers. And in a broader sense of knowing your worth, it's important and helpful to know what the market is providing to other folks in your position. In this sense, looking at the MGMA data for your specialty and region of the country can be super enlightening. The MGMA data can tell us the median rates being paid, as well as varying percentiles, helping you to gauge what you might be able to expect in terms of compensation, and also what you should feel comfortable asking for. Here, I've pulled a snapshot of the MGMA data for orthopedic surgeons specializing in spine. You'll see that it's separated by region of the country. And on the left are the various data points available, including WRVUs, the median WRVU to compensation ratio, and the total compensation, among other things. There are a couple of different other resources out there that are often considered and consulted in the field of physician compensation, but the MGMA is specifically a very trusted one. It's based on physician surveys, and it's a subscription that people like me and people in the business pay for. So it's not something that's just readily available on the internet or anything. The second step I've identified in the job search process is sorting out what factors are most important to you and your family. Is it the geographic location? Maybe you've always known that you plan to move back to your hometown or that region when you finish training. Therefore, you have a very limited area of geographic interest. For others, they might be willing to move literally anywhere in the country, and it's actually the employer type that's the biggest priority. So for instance, someone who knows conclusively that they want to work in an academic setting. So just depending on what is most important for you personally is the best place to start and narrow things down. Other factors to consider that might not be so obvious when looking at different locations: will your significant other be able to find work there? What are the schools like if you have kids? And from a money standpoint, what is the compensation, or excuse me, the cost of living versus compensation? If you're looking exclusively at larger metropolitan areas in perhaps cities that are super desirable geographically, then you need to be prepared for the fact that the cost of living to compensation ratio is going to be much less favorable versus a situation where people are looking at positions in rural areas where those jobs and roles are just inherently tougher to fill, and the compensation there might be much higher, and then the cost of living lower. So it's, of course, a little bit counterintuitive and seemingly unfair, for lack of a better word, but that's the way it works. So these are all really important to keep in mind as you're going about the process and considering exactly where you would consider acceptable places to live and work. And lastly, there are some states that are just inherently, quote unquote, better for physicians. You can actually find various polls online that rank the states best and worst based on a variety of factors, like compensation adjusted for cost of living, how litigious people tend to be there, whether the state medical boards are especially punitive, and how extensive malpractice coverage is. My third tip here is to be comprehensive and thorough. This may seem very obvious and sort of common sense, but I think it's really important to bring special attention to how valuable it is to cast a very wide net. So, for example, often physicians will look exclusively at physician job post websites when they're starting their search, but my advice is to reach out to each and every single potential employer that falls within your desired criteria. So whether that's limited by geographic region or employer type, and just know that then there are many more positions to be found other than what's posted online. So consider, for example, a position where there are two doctors very nearly reaching the age of retirement in a private practice. And the practice is sort of starting to passively think about filling those roles. You wouldn't know that unless you reached out to them directly and conveyed your interest. So you may put yourself in a position of sort of having first dibs on a job opening. And employers, of course, often appreciate that type of ambition and enthusiasm. And going along with this is the importance of being thorough and being a really good communicator. I, of course, don't mean this disparagingly in any sense, but another quick disclaimer, but I do know from experience that physicians aren't always the strongest in terms of communication and follow-up and responsiveness. It's not really what doctors are typically known for. So it's really important to make these things a priority. This means sending follow-up emails, responding promptly, and even sending thank you notes following an interview. Like the saying goes, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So you just might be the person who reaches out at precisely the right moment that gets someone's attention, or a thank you note that you sent might bring you to the front of someone's mind and set you apart from all the other candidates. You just never know the difference it can make. And it's probably not annoying, especially if you're doing it out of politeness and sincerity. And again, it always conveys your enthusiasm about the job prospect, which is always a good thing. And lastly, here on the job search, again, this may seem very obvious, but there is so much incredible value to having multiple offers in hand. Having more than one offer inherently gives you stronger bargaining power. And most importantly, in my opinion, it gives you the ability to walk away if an offer is inadequate. Clearly, that's not an option for other folks who have just gotten one offer. But if you're able to say, no, I cannot accept those terms, and so employer over there offered me a more favorable contract. And that's not to say that you necessarily need to tell anyone that, but the important part is the ability to walk away, taking back some of the control in the process, whereas inherently the employers have the majority of control and power in these situations. So therefore, my advice is to not stop your job search just because you've received an offer or are anticipating an offer from an employer that you're interested in. Now I'm going to move on to the contract portion of things. So hopefully you have one or more job offers in hand. So what does that process look like and what's next? Generally, employers will share an employment agreement with the physician after a good amount of ongoing communication. Of course, you've been in touch with these people, you've been interviewed, likely more than once, and then they offer you the job. And the way they do that is to send you their employment agreement, which they usually just send via email. And the employment agreement is the contract that outlines all the terms of your employment on their behalf. So just to be clear, I'll use the term agreement interchangeably with contract. Once the agreement is offered, you presumably have a bit of a relationship with the employer after all this ongoing communication. So many people feel uncomfortable with giving any amount of quote unquote pushback, whether that means just asking questions for clarification or actually negotiating various aspects, and especially just at the prospect of enlisting an attorney. I, of course, advocate very strongly in favor of seeking legal guidance. So I want to talk a little bit just to put that situation into perspective. An employment agreement is for a physician is never just a term sheet with bullet points outlining various things like how much you're going to be paid and what their basic expectations are for you about the job. The opposite of true. The opposite is true. Physician employment agreements are always very comprehensive and binding legal documents. They average around 30 pages long. They are full of legalese, and of course, they are written by lawyers. So a good amount of the majority of the provisions and language that are found in there are things that a layperson would not understand. And again, I of course don't mean that disparagingly. By layperson, I just mean non-lawyers. And actually, even for lawyers, a lot of the terms are going to be relatively foreign for those who don't specialize specifically in physician employment agreements. So this is all to say that you just have to be really realistic and smart and pragmatic when you enter the contract phase of things. And this probably means hiring a lawyer. And to be clear, just for your perspective, many physician employment agreements actually contain language that specifically addresses each party's right and opportunity to access legal counsel. It's often written right into the agreement. I've included some example language here that is similar language is commonly found in employment agreements. So this is a common thing. physicians often do hire attorneys, no matter what anyone tells you. And I will tell you very clearly that any employer, no matter what type, whether it's a hospital or private group, they should be more than okay with you seeking legal guidance. And I would certainly consider it a very, very significant red flag if they discourage that in any way, even if it's their policy to never negotiate, or if they aren't willing to amend any terms of the contract. It's still incredibly important to know what the contract says and what it means for you. So again, I certainly encourage everyone to seek the advice of counsel before signing an employment agreement. And when hiring someone, be sure that you know what you're getting and how much you are paying. Most attorneys, of course, work off an hourly rate. I personally do contract review work on a flat rate fee approach. But either way, you just need to know what to expect, what you're getting, and what the service entails. I know many attorneys who do this type of work, they often limit their reviews in one way or the other, or they'll only provide analysis on certain provisions of the contract. So just, again, be aware so that you can gauge your expectations of what you're getting for your money. And I touched on this before, but it's really important to have an attorney that specializes specifically in physician employment agreements. They are unique in many ways, and they contain terms and provisions that are very specific to the field of medicine and the type of work that physicians do. So a lot of these provisions wouldn't even necessarily be found in other employment settings. So the attorney needs to know what to look out for. And also, you just want your attorney to be able to tell you from experience whether the agreement is reasonable, whether any given provision is standard and fair. And that type of insight can obviously only come from experience. So after you've hopefully hired an attorney that you're comfortable with, what sorts of things should you be on the lookout for? Or hopefully that your attorney will be on the lookout for you. Based on my experience, I'll touch on some of the most significant and potentially problematic contract aspects. The first is med mal coverage. What type of policy is the employer going to provide? Is it occurrence-based or is it claims made? If it's claims made, who's going to pay for the tail coverage? If all these terms are completely foreign and unknown to you, then that just, emphasizes my point of why you need an attorney. The second is compensation. What are they offering you and how is it structured? Is it a straight base salary or do you have the opportunity to earn incentive compensation? If there is productivity compensation, how transparent will the employer be about that? How often is it calculated? How often is it paid out? All super important questions to ask. Is there a bonus payment? Is there any potential for it to be reworked in case you and your family actually need the money now? All sorts of different approaches you can use there and think about. Termination provisions are hugely important, probably the most significant aspect of a contract, in my opinion. That's largely due to the fact that so many other contract provisions are often directly tied to the termination provisions. For example, sometimes the application of a non-compete is dependent on how the contract terminates, or a physician's potential repayment of his or her signing bonus is often conditioned on how and when termination takes place. So there are all these coinciding issues that are attached to termination, but it's equally important just for a straightforward termination without cause, you need to know how much notice is required. How much advanced planning will you need to do if you want to move or change jobs, and what other provisions of the contract will be triggered if you utilize your right to terminate. The non-compete covenants. These are, of course, hugely important as well, because when it comes down to it, what we're talking about is a potential restriction on your ability to work and earn money, which of course would be very problematic and impactful on your life. I think I've only ever seen one physician employment agreement that didn't have a non-compete. And I can't even remember, what the case with that was or why that was the situation. But my point, of course, being that it's pretty much a given. It's an assumed aspect of your contract. You are definitely going to be bound by a non-compete. Most employers write them very overly broadly and make them incredibly restrictive, even if that's not going to necessarily be reasonable or enforceable. In my opinion, their goal is to essentially, scare physicians and therefore use the non-compete as a deterrent more than a legitimate means of preventing you from working. And they're not wrong, because they are very effective in that way. No one wants to violate the terms of a legally binding contract, and also no one wants to challenge it in court to find out. People often ask about enforceability in general terms, but it's very difficult to say what is and what isn't enforceable, because every state has different standards. And also there are pretty much no bright line rules as to how they can be written. It's generally this question of reasonableness, but there aren't any strict rules for what is reasonable. So it's sort of a tricky and murky thing. What I advocate is the importance of knowing what adjustments to the non-compete would be reasonable to ask for and most helpful to your situation. Obviously, so that you can request those changes before you sign the contract. So in other words, you need to know what adjustments can and should be made in advance, which in my experience essentially boils down to limiting the non-compete's application based on the cause for termination to make sure that you are only potentially bound by it in the most limited number of circumstances. Other contract terms that can be significant are those pertaining to practice locations, where you'll be expected to provide services. Will you have the right to give input on that, or consent or not consent to any potential changes? Bonus payments and any strings attached to those requiring potential repayment, paying back the bonus that was given to you. Professional activities outside of the agreement. Will you be allowed to work, whether it's research, consulting, serving as an expert witness? Will you be able to engage in those types of activities? And if so, will you be able to keep the money that you earn? Here are a couple of examples of problematic contract terms that are very common. And sort of just read through a few of those. The first one is the non-compete covenant that applies following termination of the agreement for any reason. As I mentioned, I think it's important to limit the application of a non-compete so that a physician isn't necessarily bound by it following termination or following each type of termination. For instance, if an employer terminates you without cause, you don't want to be bound by their non-compete because termination was completely out of your control if they just fired you for no reason. Tail coverage, potentially a hugely expensive, burdensome issue. If that's going to be placed on you following termination, again, if it's for any reason more problematic, we'd like to limit the instances of the physician having to pay for his own tail coverage. Just a couple more examples there. One of the sort of general and overarching things that I advise is basically that it never hurts to ask. Of course, there's like the 1 in a million circumstance where a very aggressive and combative physician asks for too much and asks for it in the wrong way. And the employer realizes, hey, wait, we actually don't want to work with someone like this. So they end up withdrawing the offer. But that is an exceptionally rare situation. So I always recommend asking, particularly for the things that are most important and would be most helpful to you and your family, because you never know what you could have gotten had you simply asked. I can't tell you how many times I've secured a signing bonus or just a higher bonus for clients, or relocation expense reimbursement, or any number of things simply because I said, hey, this is something that I often see offered. We should ask for it. And then the employer says, sure. In the majority of circumstances, the worst that can happen is that they say no, and that's not so bad. And to my point about how you ask, there's always a way to do things amicably and politely and without making it uncomfortable for anyone or ruffling any feathers, even if it's money that you're asking for. So although it is, somewhat of an adversarial situation, just by virtue of the fact that you are opposing parties to a contract, it doesn't have to be negative or combative in any way. My final sort of overarching tip about the negotiation process is to get everything in writing, whether you're talking about amendments to the agreement that you specifically negotiated, or perhaps aspects of your employment that were promised or guaranteed to you verbally throughout your communications or in the interview process. It's really important to incorporate everything into the written agreement. So just for example, maybe throughout your communications with the employer, they assured you that you'd have a dedicated physician assistant, PA, just for instance. I'd recommend asking them to put that in the contract. That's just one minor example. And then with regard to aspects of the agreement that have been negotiated, you need to make sure to be thorough and review things and make sure that they actually are incorporated. I've seen this a number of times where the employer sent back to me an updated version of the contract that was supposed to incorporate all of our agreed upon changes, but some of those were completely omitted. I think that many of those were probably just oversights and that the omissions were unintentional, but that doesn't discount how problematic it was. So it's just lucky in those situations that we did another review and realized the fact that not all the changes were incorporated. So again, whether you need to compare documents line by line or perform a subsequent review, my advice is to just not necessarily take anyone's word for it and do your due diligence to make sure that the agreement, incorporates everything that it's supposed to. And to end here, I have included some real life horror stories, so to speak. So these are terms and provisions I have actually seen, on more than one occasion in various physician employment agreements that seem, incredibly unreasonable, unfair. But these things exist and you might not know what you're signing if you aren't, properly advised through the process. So these aren't necessarily to scare you. I just think it's important to be aware of what really can happen and what really potentially might be in your employment contract. The first one is the most egregious. This is a physician where a physician was expected to sign a contract that required her to pay liquidated damages of $30,000 if the agreement terminated for any reason during her first 3 years of employment. So that would have included even if the employer terminated her without cause. The next one is about locations. This is pretty common, physicians being required to serve various locations of the employer at the employer's whim, basically, and in their sole discretion without the physician's input. So if you consider a situation where a remote clinic opens up, or there's a new facility or a separate facility that you never contemplated working at, but suddenly you're expected to serve there and it's an hour drive away from your house, that would be an entirely different working situation than you had ever anticipated. Owing back the full amount of a signing bonus upon termination of the agreement for any reason. Again, this is one of those where we would prefer that the repercussions be conditioned on the cause for termination, because again, this was a situation where even if she was terminated without cause, or even if she had to terminate for cause based on the employer's breach, she was going to have to pay back the full amount of her signing bonus. Of course, seemingly really inequitable. A very common thing is for physicians to essentially assign to their employer ownership of any intellectual property that they come up with during the term of their agreement. And then this last one here is a contract that required a full year advance notice before termination could take place without cause. And just for your reference, usually without cause termination can be allowed with a much shorter notice period, which is of course, more favorable. It would be pretty incredible to be able to plan ahead an entire year or to give that much notice if you need to make a move or a change. So that is the extent of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Laura, that was awesome. Thank you very much. I guess I'll take over from here and start sharing my screen.
Okay.
So my name's Justin Stahl. I'm in my first year of practice with Rothman Orthopedic Group up in the northern New Jersey region. I'll be talking first briefly about doing a job search and hopefully landing that first job, and then pass it off to Dr. Mangan for his take on that before we get to a brief case discussion, really focused on kind of what to be aware of and what to be thinking about as you go into your first cases and attending. So I just would urge everybody to follow the words of Maximus, maybe not to that extreme, but what we do on a daily basis echoes as we kind of go down our road. So he was famous for the quote that's in the picture there. And what I mean is that you're always on. And so anything can lead to a connection and then a potential job opportunity. So, you know, whether it's during your sub-I or during your fellowship, even if you've accepted a job, working a job, or you haven't started looking yet, the way that you conduct yourself could potentially lead to opportunities in the future. Kind of riffing on that, I think that to a certain degree, bad days reveal more about a person than the good days. It's easy to be on point. It's easy to carry yourself well when everything's going in your favor. The way that you respond to adversity, the way that you handle failure, I think reads just as much or more about your character than anything else. And the way that you rebound from that kind of shows resiliency in a way that few other things can, especially in the field that, you know, we're choosing to practice. Medicine, orthopedic surgery, spine surgery, all neurosurgery, you know, we deal with life and death situations, and recovering from failures is important. And then the last thing I would just urge everybody to be inquisitive, to be thoughtful, to be humble. Really think about what kind of persona that you want to put out there for the world to see. Again, no matter what you're doing, you could be potentially running into people with either a lead or a job opportunity or a connection that's going to take you down a path of intrigue. And if you go through the world with open eyes, I think you're going to have all those opportunities that you might otherwise not if you didn't keep an open mind. So I'll get off my soapbox now and kind of talk about what my road to my first job looked like. So this is my mugshot there. I did my undergraduate at Princeton, took a few years in a circuitous route to get to medical school, which I did at Thomas Jefferson. I stayed there and the Rothman group for my residency, and then ended up at the University of Utah for my fellowship. I didn't really start my job search until chief year, and it came about actually through different connections that I had, and very organically. I think that if I was doing it over, I wish that I had spoken to more groups and been more proactive from the get-go, just to get exposure to what different people are doing and how different practices are set up. So the first thing that I think is important to consider, and Laura touched on a lot of this, her presentation was really spectacular. So I hope you were all able to get the information from the beginning, is where do you want to be? These highlight kind of the different areas of the country that I had lived in at different points in time. And so my point is that I was all over the place, and geographically I had a lot of insight, but really I was narrowing my search down to the Rockies and the East Coast just based on, where I had my networks and where my family and friends were located primarily. So thing number one, where do you want to be? And some people are open to going wherever, and some people, like Laura alluded to, are kind of resigned, for better or for worse, to going back to exactly where they grew up. But no matter where you stand, it's good to have an idea. What do you want? Besides the location, whether it's time and autonomy, or whether it's financial reward, whether it's prestige, publications, being able to stand and give podium talks, or teaching, there are different components and different opportunities, whether you're in a private practice, working in a hospital setting, or joining an academic institution. And I wouldn't say that any of those are limited to one type of practice. But they certainly are skewed in different directions depending on where you end up. And then, this will be repeated several times, I'm sure. What does your spouse want? Because their happiness is important to your happiness and your success also. And so this is Meatloaf, famous for 2 out of 3 ain't bad. When you're considering what's important to you, the location, whether or not what type of practice it is, and what your compensation is going to be, getting 2 out of those 3 is really a pretty good deal. If you can get all 3, you've hit the jackpot. So when you start, everyone's different. Like I said, my search was pretty organic. It kind of came to me during chief year. But I think a general rule of thumb is start during your chief year of residency, even if it's just meeting practices in person to get kind of their lay of the land. Going into fellowship, which is busy and ends hopefully with a job to start once you're done, it's good to have that kind of information experience behind you. So it's important to make connections. When you go to meetings, whether you're a medical student presenting your first piece of work, or you're going during chief year to the academy meeting, it's important to make connections. And I hate the term networking because it sounds kind of premeditated, but be yourself and just be interested and involved in what's happening around you. Use your residency alumni network, both co-residents, former fellows, attendings, etc. They're some of your best resources because, like I was alluding to about the bad days, they know your personality in and out. And so they're going to be able to really help you. Use friends of the family, use industry reps. Oftentimes the reps know about job openings that never get posted before anybody else because they're in the OR. They hear the discussions when no one else thinks that they're listening. So use everybody you can to kind of get connections and just gain information starting at least during your chief year. This is similar. I think how you connect to these practices when it becomes time to officially get word out there that you're interested in learning more, using your attendings, I think, is number one. I think that that's the easiest way to do it. They have credibility, they have clout, and they have more connections likely than you do at that point in your career. Again, the reps, I think, are a really good resource that are probably underutilized. You can use headhunters, who's their job to connect you. And last, cold calls and cold emails really work wonders. To Laura's point, a lot of jobs are never posted. It's just being at the right place at the right time and expressing the right interest. And then, of course, make sure your CV is up to date. If your CV is not up to date, do it as soon as we log off here. As you go through this process, it's going to be something that's pivotal. And the last thing you want to do is get held up for a day or two because you have to make some updates to the things that you've published or what you've done in the meantime. I only have a couple more slides here and then I'll pass it off to Dr. Mangan. When it comes time to interview, do your research. Know about the group that you're interviewing with or getting to know. It's important to know what they want to be perceived as, what their ethos is. who they work with, whether it's hospitals or whether they have partnerships with different organizations. And then it's important to know who the other physicians are. And, this is a meeting geared towards spine. So know who the spine surgeons are, know something about their background. If they're involved in particular types of research, that's important stuff. And even if they invite you to go visit them and they're recruiting you, do your due diligence and express interest in who they are and where they come from. I put visit in person on here to make a special point, as things change and go back more towards normal after COVID. There's nothing as important as seeing and meeting people, getting a feel for things in person. Nothing replaces that. No Zoom interviews, no virtual tours. You really have to be there in person. And then ask the questions and ask for explanations if you don't understand the first answer. A lot of the contract talk is legalese, as Laura kind of suggested. A lot of the financials are very, they're not tailored to physicians that haven't done any business school classes. And so it's important to at least have a very rudimentary understanding. And so make sure that you get that when you go to your interview. Lastly, I think it's important to talk to people that have left. Why did they leave? Ask to get in touch with them. Make sure that there's no funny business going on there. And then also ask to talk to the other new associates and other new hires. Those are more likely than not going to be the people you go through your career with. And so I think it's important to get a sense for who else is going to be there with you. Finally, once you got an offer, get an idea for when they want you to respond to them with something official. It's important because a lot of times they'll give you some time to go through it, talk to your spouse, etc. But you don't want to put them out to dry by leaving them hanging with an offer. To Laura's point, have a lawyer look over your offer or someone that specializes in contract negotiation. Discuss your contract and the job with mentors. Discuss it with your spouse. And then when you're ready, when you've done everything else, then it's time to sign. I hope this was helpful. I'll be available afterwards to answer any questions. And right now, I will pass it over to John for his take on finding your job.
Thanks, Justin. That was great. I'm pulling up my slides now. If they will go up. Sorry, 1 second, everybody. For some reason, Zoom doesn't want to let me share.
John, do you want me to go through my case while you try to sort that out?
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Here, let me.
Okay. So this is my first case. It's less kind of case discussion as you would do in a pre-op post-op conference and more kind of, the things to think about as you're getting ready to do your first case. This is going to be brief, but I would just say plan for your case. And that starts with making your preference cards and, your attendings that you work with now, whether you're a resident or fellow, they have their preference cards. Ask to look at them because, to be honest with you, I didn't do that until after fellowship. And it would have really been beneficial to kind of get their input and feedback on things, because not everything that's written on the preference card is exactly how you do it. And so getting clarification and really kind of using their preference cards to make your own, I think, is really useful. The purpose of these, what I call preference cards, is a list of all the equipment that's needed, as well as how you plan to do it. So it says here, make sure the hospital knows what you want / need to do your case. That's the equipment and how you plan to do it. What's the setup? Where's the table? Where does the imaging goes? Your glove size? What do they do pre-procedure? Do you need a Foley for this case? What else needs to kind of be taken care of? And not that you're not there to help facilitate, but having everybody else on the same plan with the plan in hand from the get-go is really helpful. And then what special equipment do you need? Are you going to use a microscope? Are you using a robot, etc.? These are things that it's good for everybody to know before you ever book your first case. The OR should be prepared to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. So I say plan for it. In other words, practice. So Allen Iverson was famous for not having to practice. Unfortunately, we are all physicians, and that's what it's called a practice for a reason, because you need to practice. You need to maintain your skills. And along that line of thinking, practice for signing your patient up in clinic. Don't wait until a patient walks in and is ready for surgery to go through the consent form with your clinical assistant or your nurse or PA or whoever's helping you. Make sure that goes smoothly. It'll make the patient feel better. It'll make you feel better. This is something that I did, and I'm glad that I did it. Make sure that you've got all the documents in order, ready to go in a surgical packet before that patient shows up, including your booking sheets. Your booking sheets will remind you of some of the things that you'll need for the case, whether it's neuromonitoring or special equipment or blood or pre-op checklists for clearances. That should have all of it there. And so, get your ducks in a row. And like I say here, or I already alluded to, go over this stuff with the people that are going to be helping you, because having a team that's on the same page is really important as you're going forward and getting things set up. Do a dry run. So this is one of the things that I'm most grateful to myself for doing. I went over to the hospital the day before my first case. I made sure that they had everything I needed. I looked at the trays. I was doing a posterior cervical, which you'll see. I wanted to do it on a Jackson table with bivector traction. That wasn't an option for me, which I wouldn't have known if I didn't go over there and tried to iron it out. So I ended up using a Skytron bed with Mayfield tongs, and it was fine. But the last thing you want to do on the day of surgery is to have to audible to something that you might not be comfortable with, you might not have had exposure to, God forbid. But the point is to get that ironed out before there's a patient in the pre-op holding area. So think about what you need. Look at everything you're going to be using. Have a plan B, have a backup plan, and make sure that you've thought about that before you get to the OR also. Talk with your nurse coordinator, touch base with the reps, make sure everybody knows what's going on. Along those lines, do the case over and over your head. Write down your steps, whatever you need to do to go over each portion of what you're going to be embarking on. And then also what the pitfalls could be, what the worst case scenario is, and make sure you know who's around to help and how to get in touch with them. Like I said before, we do a high stakes job, and there's a lot of bad things that can happen. And so knowing who's around, especially during your first cases is incredibly important. So just briefly, the purpose of this is to talk about, what to be thinking going into your case. So I won't belabor this. This is a 60-year-old female with myelopathy. She has multiple levels of stenosis with myelomalacia. She was having both upper extremity and lower extremity issues. And as I mentioned, she's a seamstress, so she can't feel her hands. She can't do her job. She was still full strength, but she had decreased sensation bilaterally in her upper extremities with a really profound Hoffman. And she had mild symptoms for years and years that got worse all of a sudden. So this is her MRI. I got x-rays in the office. I also got a CT scan for surgical planning because I chose to go to T1 for my screws. So as I mentioned, I used a Skytron bed with Mayfield tongs. I had neuromonitoring there. I was scrubbed with my senior partner, so I had somebody to help, in case I needed it. And I'm grateful that he was there for me because I think that it helped the flow of everything just go a little bit better. And it was an uncomplicated case where we did a C3 to 7 decompression. We fused to T1. And I put her in a Philly collar afterwards. She discharged home on post-op day 3 without any incident. And I just saw her back and she's doing great. So what would I do differently? This is the movie poster from Hot Shots Part 2, one of my favorite sequels. What I would have done differently is I would have met the floor team pre-op. I didn't think about that ahead of time, and I wish I would have, especially physical therapy. I did this case on a Friday. The patient left on Monday, and partially because I couldn't really interpret the PT notes. Now, after talking with them thereafter, they thought Monday was the right day for her discharge, but I wish I would have, been speaking their language from the beginning. I prefer an Aspen collar. I wish that I would have made sure that they had the appropriate orthotics there. And I would have templated my paperwork just for speed after the case and for discharging. But other than that, I'm grateful that the case went well. I'm grateful that she's doing well. And I hope that you can, learn from the things that I would have improved on with this knowledge. So with that, I'll turn it over to John. Hopefully he's got his PowerPoint stuff figured out.
All right. Can you see the screen?
That looks great.
Great.
Good.
Perfect. So I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit here. I'm also going to try to be conscious of time. So I'm John Mangan. I'm one of the spine surgeons at Rothman Orthopedics in Philadelphia, and lucky to be Justin's partner. But I want to give a little bit of background before I talked about how I got to the job that I'm in. So I was more in the camp, unlike Justin, where my goal was to be in Philadelphia. I was born and raised in Philly. My wife has a job in Philadelphia that she loves. She doesn't want to move. Our families are close. I trained here with Justin at Rothman at Jefferson, and then I went and I did my fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic and at Metro Health. And my goals, going into looking for jobs was ideally I wanted a private-demic or an academic job. But I did interview at private practices and academic centers in the area. And I really like to teach, and I really like research, obviously on top of clinical medicine. So those are all the things that I was going about when I went about picking a job. And this has been said several times before, but I think, it's important to really figure out, where do you want to live? Where does your significant other want to live? And what type of a career do you want? There's academic jobs, private-demic jobs. And it's just trying to figure out what is going to make you happy in the end and what's the right career for you. And the truth is that, there's pros and cons to every practice and every practice setting. Each job has its own pros and cons. And, really at the end of the day, kind of like Justin said, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You have to figure out what pros you really want or what you need, and which cons you're okay with, or, things that you're not ultimately going to get in that job. And unfortunately, kind of like Laura alluded to, unfortunately, a lot of the opportunities come down to timing. So, being aware of what you want and being able to kind of seek it out sooner is usually better than not. So how to find out if somewhere's hiring? I think, both Justin and Laura touched on this, so I'll just briefly go over it. But, most job opportunities are going to require some legwork. I did a lot of cold calling, a lot of cold emailing when I was trying to figure out which job opportunities would be available, especially because I had such a confined area where I was just looking, within a few hours of Philadelphia. And that was where, that was once I had identified where I wanted to be and what kind of practice I wanted. Justin really highlighted this well, but I really utilized my network of mentors and my peers as well to help identify job opportunities. Like Justin, my job search really also started organically. In fact, one of the other now spine surgeons who was an applicant for spine fellowship with me got offered or got asked if he was interested in a job in Philadelphia, and his priority was elsewhere in the country, so he kind of passed my information along. And that's kind of how I started my job search. So you never know who's going to be able to help you try to identify opportunities. So really kind of utilize that network that you've worked so hard to build. And I think Laura touched on this too, but most jobs I think will be filled before they're ever posted. So that's why cold emails and cold calls or having mentors reach out or friends tell you about jobs, that's really I think the most effective way to go about trying to find out if somewhere is hiring. So once you get the interview, for this, I tried to share, what are the thoughts that I had going through my head when I interviewed at different groups and different departments, and, what's the culture of the group? What's the culture of the department? It's really important to see, like, are the surgeons happy? But I think just as important is the ancillary staff happy? Is the people at the front desk happy? Are the people that are working in, your pod or your office happy? Is there a lot of staff turnover? Does it seem like there's a lot of new people around when you're interviewing? And then, kind of just knowing about the group, is there a high rate of surgeon turnover? And like Justin said, find out who the junior surgeons are, go meet them, go talk to them, find out if they're happy in their careers, because that's, ultimately probably the group that you're going to go through the practice with. And it's important to know those people and to know their thoughts as a junior in that department. This is something I never thought about when I was a fellow until I started the job process or a resident. But, why is a group hiring? I think this is something that is kind of hugely important in your decision making, or at least understanding kind of what you're getting yourself into. So, why are they hiring? Did somebody leave the group? And if so, why did they leave? Those are the things you want to try to figure out. Or is it a new practice that's trying to develop a spine program? And if so, what are the resources that they're going to utilize to help you grow that program? And what resources do they have available as a spine program now? Is there non-operative providers that are going to be there to be your partners? Or kind of what's the plan? And then, or is, some groups are just trying to expand their practice. They have already a spine practice that's up and running, and maybe they have more volume that they can handle and they want to add a new surgeon. But I think trying to figure out why they're trying to hire you is important, so you can figure out what your role in that group is going to be. Next, I think it's important to look at, does the area need a new spine surgeon? Some groups I interviewed with really couldn't answer the question as to why are they hiring me. It was more just that they wanted another spine surgeon in their practice, but I hadn't felt like they really had evaluated the competition in the area or try to figure out, where I was going to fit in their practice. So knowing the area, doing a search online, being prepared and seeing, how does the competition look in the area? And I think when you're on the interview, it's important to know, is there any practice patterns or conflicts that the practice has with their ability to help you build a practice? I actually had one group tell me that they actually co-owned a surgery center with a different spine group. So they were going to keep referring their spine patients to that group, and I would kind of build my own practice. So, all of these factors can come into play. So the only question you don't know the answer to is the one you didn't ask. So it's really important to try to get into the idea of why are they hiring you and why do they need you? Again, along with the idea of, like, what is your role in the practice? I think it's important to understand, what is their expectation for you? Are you going to be in one location or multiple? How many hospitals will you cover or will you operate at? And is there a certain type of practice that they're hoping that you're going to bring to add to their practice, to their department? Do they want you to be a deformity surgeon or a degenerative surgeon, MIS surgeon? All these things can come into play as to your fit and your role and your comfort within that department. So it's important to kind of get that knowledge up front. And, it's important to know is how are they going to support you in this role? Are they going to market you? Are they going to help, fill your surgical schedule and fill your office schedule? Is there mentorship available within that department to help you, like Justin said, go through the trials and tribulations of becoming an attending and a surgeon? I think all these things are sometimes overlooked, but very important. And just to briefly go over this, I think this is applicable whether you're going into academics or into private practice. And it's, what is the corporate governance structure? How are decisions made within the group? Are you, as a junior partner, are you told what you're going to do, or are you kind of invited into the decision-making process? Is there transparency about decisions and opportunities and the financials of the department or the group? How is overhead calculated? I think, for all the groups that I interviewed with, including academic places, overhead was calculated or looked at differently. So it's important to understand how that comes to play and how it affects your salary or your payment structure. Along with that is, how are you paid? The interesting thing about medicine, I think, is every practice has a different way that they pay their employees or their surgeons, as well as academic centers. They're all incentivized differently. So it's important to understand how you're paid and what you're paid. For example, I interviewed at a group that said that, they get paid for call, and that was a major source of income for most of the surgeons in the group. However, after I was on my second or third interview there, and getting closer to an offer, they said, well, we do get paid to take call, but you won't be able to be on the call schedule, because nobody wanted to give up space for me to join the call schedule, which obviously impacted the total compensation for the job. So again, you just need to ask those questions to figure out, what's the right job for you. And like Laura mentioned, does the group cover your malpractice or your tail insurance? All these things you want to know going into the job. Also important, I think, in academics or in private practice is, how do you advance within the job? What's the track for promotion? For academic jobs, is there a minimum time that you have to spend before you can move up in your professorship rank? And what are the requirements to move up? Is it based on objective criteria, or is it based on stewardship and somebody's going to tell you and you're able to be promoted? The same thing goes along with becoming a partner in a practice. Is there a time limit? Is there objective requirements that you must meet? Or again, is it something that's not as concrete and hard to achieve? All of these things you want to know before you go into a job, so you know what your future looks like. In terms of academics, if you're interested in academics, you want to know, is there teaching required, or is it available if you want to be able to do it? Is there a research requirement if it's an academic job, and are you incentivized or penalized based on that research productivity? And then if you are going to be doing research, what research resources do they have available to help you get started? Do they have statisticians? Do they have research assistants? All these things are very important to kind of understand before you sign the job. And I think it's important to know, how does the future look for the group? And one way to do that is to look at the health systems that they're affiliated with. How are those health systems doing? How are they doing financially? What's their reputation in the community? And along with that is, what is your potential within the group? What is your potential for leadership to move up into the group? And what are the future goals, of the department or the group? Are they hoping to expand in the future? Do they want to add more services or add more providers? And one thing that I just thought was interesting throughout my process was, for groups that told me that they really wanted to expand and they wanted to grow their practice, and they required a buy-in to become a member of that practice. One of the questions I always had was, what is the buy-in used for? Is it divvied up amongst partners, or is that the capital that they use to grow? And the group's taking on debt. I think those are all, that's a little detailed, but those are the things that, to me, I found interesting comparing group to group, which can be kind of give you an insight as to how the group kind of functions internally. And as Laura said, the restrictive covenant or the non-compete, one of my mentors in residency used to say the most important part of a job is how to get out of it. I think, one of the things that we've all touched on is the most basic and important part of the job process may be location for some of us. So, if you get yourself into a situation where you found the location that you and your family are happy, you want to make sure that, if your job doesn't work out, that you're able to transition to another job opportunity in the area. And so the most important part of a job is how to get out of it. I know we're getting close, or we're probably at the 9 o'clock limit, so I will keep talking fairly briefly for this. So after the interview, what are the important things to do? I think schedule a second visit. I have that at the bottom, but that might be the most important part is go back and see the group, talk to people again, see if you get the same gut feeling that you had the first time you were there. And then I think it's important to talk to people who've left the group. You want to find out if why they left. Did people leave because they were unhappy and they didn't like the group? Or do they move because their significant other got a job opportunity somewhere else that they had to take? Both of those can sway your decision pretty significantly. So it's important to kind of reach out and talk to those people, because I think you might be surprised to what you might hear people say the reasons that they left. And I also think it's nice to talk to people who know the group but are not part of the group. How is the group viewed externally? You know, what is the reputation of the group? How does their culture viewed externally? All of these will kind of give you insights into kind of the real group that you're joining or department. And in the end, the decision comes down to what's best for you and your family. Does your significant other agree or support your decision? And which of the group has the best pros and cons, in your opinion? And I think at that point, the decision becomes easy. You know, we all have a finite number of offers, and it just comes down to which one feels right and which one has the best pros to con ratio that your family supports. So that was my kind of run through. It was a lot of information. I apologize. I know we're kind of going over here. And I'll briefly go through this first case. This first case, kind of like Justin's, this isn't actually a first case that I've done, but this I kind of looked at as a new attending. What are the things that I wish I thought about 6 months ago, a year ago, as a chief resident, as a fellow, and how would they help me to kind of get started in practice? And Justin talked about a lot of these, so I'll try to be brief. The way I think about starting practice is really obstacles and opportunities. You know, for me, I started at a practice that I was familiar with, that I trained here from residency, but I'm in a new location. And so for me, you know, the question was, what are the obstacles that I'm facing? Well, the facility does already do spine surgery there, and they do quite a bit of it. So, you know, what I'm looking at is what equipment do they already have there, and what equipment am I going to be able to use? Do they have vendors and systems that I used in residency and fellowship? Or if so, which ones are they currently under contract with? Because that will come into play as to what you can use. And how well does the staff know the current systems? I mean, sometimes you're entering into this new system, but they're fairly well versed in using the equipment that they have, and that can make your life a lot easier as a new attending. Or Justin said, sometimes they won't have the equipment that you want or you need. So knowing that before you do your first case is very important. And if you're going to a place that's never done spine surgery, they may ask you, what equipment do you need? Or what equipment do you like? And I think it's important to know the difference between those two things is, you know, what are the required instrumentation, the required, capital improvements or capital purchases that you'll need to be able to be a spine surgeon at a hospital, versus what are the things that would be nice to have, but if you don't have them right now, you can still do your job. And then what systems do you prefer to use? Is there one in particular company that you like, or a system that you want to use? Those are, you know, things to think about when you start. One of the pieces of advice I got from one of my mentors in residency was, I think you have to understand, you know, the hospital system, or the hospital that you're working at, excuse me. You know, what are the procedures that they're performing there? What are the procedures that the hospital is used to handling there? And how capable are they of handling perioperative care that certain procedures may require? I think, like Justin said, in spine surgery, you know, sometimes we're dealing with life and death. Sometimes we're dealing, large deformity procedures or anterior posterior procedures that sometimes may require a higher level of perioperative care. And certain hospitals are just not equipped or comfortable handling those types of patients. And I think that as a young surgeon is a fast way to kind of get into trouble with the hospital system that you're trying to build a reputation in. So I think understanding your environment, understanding where you are is hugely important. And along those lines, you know, is neuromonitoring expected? I think this is something that a lot of, you know, my co-fellows and I talk about and have experienced, because different areas of the country, different hospital systems expect surgeons to use neuromonitoring. Some areas don't use it at all. I think it's just important to understand, you know, what is the expected procedures and protocols in that area. And like Justin said earlier too, what are the surgical services that are represented at the facility? Is there vascular surgery, general surgery, access surgeons, ENT, thoracic, et cetera? These can all be hugely helpful for you in planning cases and your needs. So this was a just a kind of a general brief overview of a patient. This is from Dr. Google, these pictures, but I'll just get right to it. So this is a patient that we're going to sign up for surgery. Like Justin said, what are the things that we need to think about in order to book that patient for an operation? And I kind of looked at this similar to Justin, but what is the perioperative management that you need? So before we even talk about the operating room and getting the patient there, what are the things that the hospital is going to expect you to do? Is there medical clearance that's expected? And if so, who is going to do it? How do you get your patient arranged to see that person? Some facilities, one of the ones I'm operating in, has an ERAS protocol or pre-medication before the OR. And, I just got asked, do you want to use the ERAS protocol? But I'd never gotten a copy of it. Right. So, what are these protocols that the hospital has in place? Do you want your patients to get it? You may or may not have to participate. And then how are your patients going to be managed post-operatively? Like Justin said, is it, is there a fleet of nurse practitioners and PAs on the floor, physician extenders that are going to help you, along with the nursing staff and the physical therapists? What orders do you want after surgery? Are you going to have a multimodal pain medication regimen? Are you going to anticoagulate your spine patients? These are all things you kind of want to have your playbook kind of designed going into surgery and going into practice. So you kind of know the answers to these things. And like Justin said, one of the important things to have kind of set before you even book your patient is, what are your discharge instructions? When do you want to see that patient back? What kind of orthotics do you need? Are you planning on? Those are all things you want to think about, honestly, before you even book your first patient. So everything kind of goes smoothly and it's a good experience for you, for the patient. You can maximize their outcome. So when you go to book the case, I think one of the important things is, again, knowing, like Justin said, what are the implants available? What are the trays available? What surgical tables are available? Are they ones you've used or ones you need to kind of examine before the case? I put copies of imaging on here. Sometimes, different systems have different abilities of letting us kind of access remote imaging and things like that. So making sure that you're going to be able to pull up your films in the OR, I think is an important step not to pass over. And one thing that I thought a lot about when I was starting practice is, do you need a surgical assistant and how do you get one? Some practices have physician assistants or physician extenders or first assists available. Some hospitals have them. And some don't. So, that's something that you need to figure out when you're starting practice is, do you have one available to you, or how do you get one if you need one? Again, don't expect something that's going to be there unless you've explicitly sought it out and seen it or talked to them. And then as far as instrumentation goes, Justin talked a lot about this, but, you want to find out what lives in the hospital versus what's brought in for a specific case. Most of us trained at large academic centers that have lots of sets of different instrumentations and implants that are available on the shelves. That may not be the case when you get out into practice. So you want to make sure that you're aware of kind of what's in the hospital versus what needs to be brought in. And then you really want to think about what is the backup instrumentation and implants you may need. If you think you're going to use 5.5 screws, but you may want 6.5 screws there, and you got to make sure that they're in the same set or that they're going to have them in there. If you have a screw that goes out laterally, how are you going to fix that? Do you use cannulated screws and K-wires? Do you need those as backup as well? Those are things to kind of think about. And then, what kind of implants are you going to use? Are you going to use PEEK, titanium? Are you going to use expandable cages or static cages? Do you want both available when you're doing the case? And what types of bone graft does the hospital have? What do you want to use? Those are all kind of the things that, I think most of us just go through residency and say, this is what we use here, without having to really, sort it out and see kind of what it is that you like, what it is that you think helps patients and does well. So these are the things that you kind of want to have down pat before you even get into the operating room. And just like Justin said, I think preparation is the key to success. The more prepared you are going into the operating room, going into the procedure, going into the perioperative period, I think the better success that you'll have and the better outcome the patient will have. So those are my brief comments on how to find a job and kind of first case preparation. I apologize for talking quickly. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thanks.
John, that was great. Thanks a lot. Does anyone have any questions before we sign off here? All right, great. Laura, thanks again. Really appreciate you. Appreciate all the information. That was fantastic. John, thank you for hosting. I guess we'll see everybody again in April.
Thank
Thanks,
you guys for
everyone.
having me.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it.
So
Bye.
much.
Thanks, Dr. Stahl. See ya.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.